Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. We'll most likely start about 2 minutes after, just to allow for people to come in because we are expecting quite a few people. But just as a reminder, the in your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions box that is available to you. Please feel free to post any questions that you have in that window, and then I'll do my best to answer the questions during it. If I can't get to those questions during it, the session, I will make sure to answer or do my best to answer at the end of the session. So it's about a minute to start time, but again, we'll start 2 minutes after. So we will get started in about 3 minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the DMARC Bootcamp. My name is Shehzad Mirza, and I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. So what we're basically going to do in this wrap-up session is try to do our best to, in the next 40 to 50 minutes, to basically review everything that was talked about in these past 6 weeks. So there's going to be a lot of information and a lot of brain dump that's going to happen right now. And the idea is to really focus on the main aspects of everything that was covered. So hopefully I'll be able to get everything done in this short time frame. And then towards the end, we'll talk about some other protocols as well that you may want to consider using alongside with DMARC. So let's go ahead and get started and jump right into it. So remember what we're doing here in terms of actually using DMARC, right? So DMARC is domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance. And the key parts of DMARC are those three last letters in the acronym for DMARC. So authentication, reporting, and conformance. Those are the key things that are going to be happening and what's going on in terms of actually protecting your domain, right? Because this is what DMARC is going to do. It's going to act like an identity check. So it's going to make sure that, hey, you know, this domain that's actually sending me a message is actually the domain that's supposed to be sending me messages by performing these different various types of checks, right? Because what you're going to be doing and you're implementing this, remember, again, that there's two parts to DMARC. There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification, right? The DMARC policy is something that you actually have to create. You're going to put that into place, and that's required. That's a manual effort on your part, right? There isn't something that automatically does it. At least in most cases, there aren't cases where this is automatically done for you. You may, unless you're working like a managed service provider or something like that, they could probably do it for you. But typically, the organization has to have that created, though, right? Whether it be you or if somebody is going to help you do that as and create it. And that policy is what's going to be the thing that protects your domain, right? Because that policy is applied to that one domain, and everything is going to be protected based on that policy that you create. So you, as a sending organization, must create a DMARC policy. The receiving side is what has to set up DMARC verification, because it's that DMARC verification tool that's going to check for the DMARC policy and see, is there a DMARC policy for that domain? If there is, check the policy, follow it accordingly, and handle fraudulent messages based on what's being defined here. So what you're ultimately doing at this point then is overall, by having both, right? Because technically as an organization, you should have both. You should have a policy to protect yourself and verification also to check and protect yourself from other organizations, right? Because overall what you're doing is, and the goal is to prevent fraudulent messages, to protect the integrity and the trust and the confidence in your brand and in your domain name, right? Because you want people to know that the message that they're receiving is actually coming from you, and that you're protecting these messages and looking out for everybody. So your citizens, consumers, business partners, and so on. So DMARC is going to be a vital part in terms of protecting your brand. But also remember, on the other side, the consumer side, DMARC verification is already implemented on this. So about 80% total worldwide email accounts are already protected with DMARC verification. They have it turned on. So this is the Gmail users, the Yahoo users, all the different Microsoft ones, right? So Outlook.com, Hotmail.com, and so on. They're already protected. They don't know it, but they are. So you as an organization need to do your part by creating the policy, right? Because that policy has to exist. So otherwise the consumer side doesn't know, what are we supposed to do with these messages are fraudulent. And in most cases, if it thinks it's spam, they're going to quarantine or they're going to just completely drop it and not even bother delivering it, thus reducing your reputation and causing problems because it hurts the deliverability of your messages. So that's where DMARC is going to help improve deliverability, right? By implementing DMARC at the highest level. So not at DMARC the lowest level, not at P equals none. We're talking about quarantine and reject. That's where it's going to help improve deliverability, because these email service providers are going to say, well, they have SPF, they have DKIM, and look, they have DMARC at an enforcement level. So we can trust we can at least have a better trust in this organization. So we can lift any restrictions that we may have or any filters or blocks that we have on this particular domain, because it's passing all these checks. So the reputation score now increases at that point. So therefore now your messages will in turn be actually delivered to the inbox rather than being dropped or whatnot, because that way they know these are spam and these are legitimate by implementing SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. And in most cases, they're going to require that. So like I know Google is one of the ones that has been doing that and been pushing it out, telling people like, look, we're seeing a ton of spam from you guys. We're going to keep you on a block list until you actually implement SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. And then they may even say as far as implement Google verification as well. But those things need to be in place, and it has to be DMARC at quarantine or reject. That has to be at an enforcement level. If it's not, we're going to block your messages until you do that. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen for retail stores. We've seen that happen to hospitals. We've seen that happen to cities, right? And it becomes a huge problem. And who knows who else or what other sources will actually be doing that. So delivery, this will improve and increase deliverability. And then visibility, right? Because these are one of the things that will actually let you see what's going on the receiving end. right? Because where are these reports that are being generated? Where are they coming from? They're coming from the receiving side. So the receiving side can come back to you and say, look, this is what I'm seeing in terms of your domain. You know, take whatever action you need to take. I mean, do we need to make adjustments? Do we need to make fixes? Or are we seeing spammers and phishers? And then what can we do with that data? We can block it, we can report it. You know, see if there can be something done in terms of taking those systems down, so that way it prevents any other organization from being used as part of those campaigns. So there's a lot of visibility in those reports. And I'm going to talk about the reports and review the reports again in a few slides. But remember, what specifically DMARC is protecting against, right? It's not protecting against all types of phishing and all types of spoofing. It protects against one specific type, which is domain spoofing, right? So it's making sure that the from is actually coming from a legitimate location. So what it says, so it's at companyname.com, so at globalcyberalliance.org. That's your domain, and only those who are authorized are allowed to use that domain. Everything else is supposed to be considered fraudulent. So DMARC is just going to be one of the layers that you're going to have when it comes to email protection and email authentication. So you still have your spam filters. You're still going to have your anti-phishing filters, right? Those still need to be in place, or any other types of filters that you might have, or like in your email security gateways and whatnot. Those still need to exist. You still need to have it. It's not like you implement DMARC and you said, okay, well, we don't need any of these tools anymore. No. DMARC is just one of the layers that you're going to have alongside with those other type of filtering systems. And also remember, where can you apply DMARC? If you have multiple public domains, apply it to those public domains, whether they're used for email or not. Protect them, right? Because just because you're not using them for email doesn't mean that somebody else can't use it for email, right? So, but if you put in the policy of reject, you're protecting that at that point, because then now no one can use it for email until you decide otherwise. So create a domain. So you remember too, though, you don't have to create a DMARC policy for all the subdomains, right? There's a tag that you can use to protect your subdomains. And also remember, the policy by default protects the top level or the domain you're applying it to, as well as the subdomain of that domain. So you don't have to create one for www. because that should automatically fall under your DMARC policy. But if you have something like .net, .org, .com, or some other variation, so like if we had GCA.org, globalcyberalliance.org, we need to create a policy for each one of those. Okay, so those are the things you have to, create the policy, create the SPF record you need, and create the DMARC policy at reject, so you're protecting those domains. So remember, in terms of the overview, so how does this all actually working, right? So first and foremost, you're going to publish your DMARC record, and where you're publishing that is on your DNS server. And it's got to be your public-facing DNS server. Okay, public-facing. So that's the server you're going to have that already has records for like your www. So for your website, for your mail servers, they should already be on. This should be on that same exact server as where you're going to create your SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records. Okay, so it's a public-facing one, not internal to your organization. I mean, it could be sitting internally, but it has to be one that's publicly accessible. And remember, when the sender, the person who's typing the message, this is completely transparent to them. You're not installing anything special on their system or anything new, or training them on something that they need to do in order to have all of this work. I mean, if you want to tell them that you're doing this, you can go ahead and do that. Do it part of as your security training program. Maybe just let them know that this is something that we're doing and what it means to them and at their level. But they just type up their message like they normally do. They send the email, and then the sending org's email server. That email server is what's going to do everything that needs to get done, right? It's going to add the information about the server, because that's the sending server, so the IP and whatnot. It's going to add, this is where the DKIM signature is being added on, right? Because the DKIM signing happens at the server level, unless you have a gateway. If you have an email security gateway, that's where the DKIM signing could happen as well. But that's where everything is going to happen, and then it sends out the message. The receiving side now is where it's critical, right? The receiving side must have DMARC verification turned on in order to look for DMARC policies. If it does not have DMARC verification, it's just going to go and pass through all the regular filters and all the other filters that you have in place, and then send it up to the recipient's inbox, assuming it passes all those other filters, right? Because there's nothing to tell it to look for DMARC. So, but once they have DMARC verification enabled, what will now happen is once it receives those messages, it's going to look at the from header and say, okay, let's check the DMARC policy for this domain now. And it's going to check all incoming messages for a DMARC policy. Right, so when it goes back out to the sending organization DNS server, if it does not find a DMARC policy, then obviously it treats it like a regular message and goes through the filters and sends it out, sends it to the recipient. But if it has a DMARC policy, now it's going to do the checks. It's going to do SPF checking. It's going to do DKIM checking. It's going to check for alignment for both of those to see if the alignment's in place, and then follow according to your policy how to handle the messages if they pass or if they fail. Right, that's what's going to happen. So remember the 3 levels for DMARC policy. If it's at none, that's your monitored only mode. So that basically means that, look, treat the messages and handle them like you normally would, but don't apply a policy to it because there's no enforcement from the DMARC side. But we want the reports from you, so that way if we need to, if we have to make adjustments to SPF, add DKIM records, check for alignment, we can do that and make those changes that we need to make before we go up to quarantine or reject. Because remember, if you go to quarantine and things are failing, your messages are going to go into the recipient spam junk folder. If it's at a reject, the messages don't even get delivered. So that's why it's important that before you go up to quarantine or reject, make sure everything is working as intended and as needed. Right, and remember too, you don't have to have both functional. If SPF is working and DKIM is not, that's still going to pass DMARC. Right, or vice versa. If DKIM is working and SPF is not working, it's still going to pass because one of the two has to pass. But in terms of DKIM verification and alignment have to pass, or SPF and alignment and verification, those need to pass. So those are the things you have to take into account. And then the last thing is that where are the reports coming from? Remember, they're coming from the recipient side. So the recipient server is whatever they see for your domain, whether it's legitimate or fraudulent, that's the information they're going to put in the report and send it back to you. Right, so that's one of the questions. Do we get DMARC reports from any and all emails that are sent from our domain, even if they are spoofed? As long as the receiving side is seeing it and they have DMARC verification enabled and they're sending reports, yes, the reports will contain that information. But those factors come into play, right? They have to have DMARC verification enabled, and they also have to be willing to send you reports, because there are some providers out there that actually do not send back reports, like Microsoft. Microsoft does not send reports. They're not sure why, but they're looking into. I think they're looking into it, and they're probably going to re-enable and start sending them again. But don't quote me on that. So as long as the receiving side is seeing it and they have DMARC verification, they're willing to send reports back, they will give you all the information, spoofed, legitimate third-party vendor IPs, all that information will be in that report, so that we will know what's going on. And that's why those reports are very important. Okay, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later than that. So will reports be received from recipients who do not support? No. If they do not have DMARC verification enabled, you will not get any of these reports. So let me take that. So DMARC verification is not enabled, and they're not sending reports. Those are, yeah, you're not just going to get them from anyone. DMARC verification has to be set up on the receiving side, and they have to be willing to send you those reports. Now remember, when you create this record in DNS, you're creating it as a TXT record, right? So for DMARC, it's always TXT record. And the host name must start with _DMARC. That's critical, because otherwise the verification side, the receiving side, will not know what to look for. So _DMARC, lowercase, okay? And then depending on the system you use, you may or may not have to add the domain afterwards. In most cases, you don't have to add the fully qualified domain name after _DMARC. And then remember the values as well, right? So you have the different values. This is where you're defining what your policy is. Now, one I just want to point out, because if you see here, I actually put in an email address here for the aggregate reports, the RUA equals mail2:DMARC@GCA-emailauth.org. This is a valid reporting system. It's not like what you saw in the vendor presentations where you can send it and you're going to get access to a portal or anything like that. What we're doing with this email address, the DMARC@GCA-emailauth.org, is we're setting up an aggregate reporting server but mainly to collect information and to see from that information who are the spammers and phishers, so that we can use it as try to use it as a takedown service. So once we have all this information, we'll look at it, do the analysis, look at the reputation of the IP address, and if it's determined to be fraudulent and spammers and phishers, we can work with someone to see how can we take these systems down. So that way it doesn't continuously being used for spam and spread across other domains as well, and using other legitimate domains. So if you want to send to this email address is live. So if you would like to send your reports there, please do so. But just remember, this is not something that we give access to. So don't use this as your primary reporting mechanism. This should be your secondary or tertiary in the list. Because remember, RUA equals mail to : the first email address, comma, mail to : the second one, mail to : and then you could put DMARC@GCA-emailauth.org. So put us last if you want to send us reports for the takedown purposes. We're still in a pilot phase because we're looking to see what's the viability of this. Will it actually work? Is it something that is going to be useful and be good for the greater global good? Now remember, you have so many tags here, so I'm not going to go through each and every single tag again, because remember, it took us almost 20 minutes or so to go through each of the tags. But what I want to reiterate here is that, remember the required tag. So V equals DMARC1, that's the first tag that you need to put in. Semicolon, then P equals is the second tag you're going to put in, right? Because the P tag is the one that defines the policy level. So P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. This is where you're going to make the change and make your adjustments. Okay. RUA, we're saying at GCA that it should be required. It technically is not. You don't need to have it. It's same with the RUF. But if you're at P equals none and you don't have RUA or RUF in place, then you've done nothing, right? You put in a policy, but that policy does absolutely zero, right? Because it's monitored only mode. You're not getting reports, so there's no way you're going to be able to get to quarantine or reject or find out if you're ready to go to quarantine or reject. Right? So those are things you have to take in. So the RUA is something you need to have in place. You need to have that so you can actually get those reports, do the analysis that you need, and get to quarantine and reject, because that's where you're protecting your brand. That's where you're doing enforcement and blocking fraudulent messages. So don't stay at P equals none, have RUA and look at the reports. And then the other tags are optional tags again, right? If you don't use them, it'll automatically do the default to that, right? So this is something, these were the things that we talked about in weeks 3 and 4. And those sessions are up on our site. Now remember, you need to have SPF and DKIM in order for this to work. Do you have to have both? Technically, no, you don't have to have both. But the benefit of having both is to increase the security of your and the protection of your domain. If you can have both, do both and implement both, right? Don't do just one or the other. Because remember, if you just have SPF by itself and things fail, then everything is going to fail, right? Because if you have SPF and DKIM, SPF fails, but DKIM is passing. Remember, for DMARC level, that passes. So what are these two things? So remember, SPF, that's your list of defining which servers or which systems are allowed to actually send mail on your behalf, right? If it's not on the list, it should be considered a fraudulent system. DKIM is adding that digital signature at the domain level. So remember, this is domain level, not user level. So this is something that's going to happen at the server side or the email security gateway. But that's another layer of authentication you're adding by putting in and implementing DKIM. So we do strong, especially when you're using cloud service providers, use both if you can, especially if they provide it. You can get away with just having one, but if they have both, do both. Now remember, when it comes to SPF and you're creating these records, use the -all or ~all. What you really want to ultimately use is the -all because it's a hard fail. So that basically means it has to be on this list in order for it to be considered an authorized message. ~all is a soft fail, basically meaning that it has to be on the list, but if it's not on the list, just mark the message as non-compliant because it's not on our list. And then the sending side or the receiving side has to figure out what to do with that. But so ultimately what you really want to use is the dash L. Don't use plus, don't use question mark, because plus is basically saying anything is allowed. So there's no point in creating the SPF record if you do that. And remember, you can only have one record per domain, right? It's only one record per domain. And there's a big difference between flattening and dynamic or instant, because each of the vendors call this something different, right? Flattening is when you're actually taking your domains in your SPF and converting them to IP addresses. So your entire SPF is just based on IPs. But there's a problem with flattening, right? It may help because you can bypass the 10 domain lookup issue, but if those IPs happen to be third parties, you don't have control over those IP addresses, right? That's a problem. Because if they change something, like if they remove an IP or if they add an IP, things can potentially break. So SPF could fail at some point, right? Even though you're bypassing the 10 domain lookup, but unless you keep track of it, and even if you are reject, right, you'd have to keep track of the reports to make sure you keep updating those IP addresses if anything were to change. So the whole dynamic and instant SPF is where you're letting a vendor, a third party, handle your SPF for you because they have mechanisms and things that they have in place to bypass that 10 domain lookup issue. And also remember, there's a difference between SPF alignment and SPF verification. They're two different things, right? SPF verification can be done on its own. It doesn't need to have DMARC in order to do SPF verification. DMARC just utilizes SPF verification, and on top of that, it adds the alignment aspect of it. Right, so verification, what's going on is checking the domain in the return path or in the envelope section of the email header. It's looking that up to see what the SPF policy is for that domain, and then compare that information there in terms of IPs or domains being used. Alignment is comparing the return path or the envelope from domain with the from header domain. So as long as those domains match, you're in alignment. Okay. So that's the difference. So again, so SPF, so in this case here, this is good alignment, right? Because our from and our return path, the domains match. But for SPF verification is where this last line here is, it's basically looking up globalcyberalliance.org and saying like, hey, this is the IP address we got the message from. Is it on your list? Is it on your SPF? Oh, it is on your SPF, so therefore it's allowed. So this is good, so it passes. So this is why when you have like a failure type aspect, in this case, this is not aligned because the from has globalcyberalliance.org, but the return path has this other domain. So this is DMARC fail unaligned. So that's causing a problem. But SPF verification is passing, right? Because remember, what is it looking for when it does SPF verification? It's looking at the domain from the return path. So it's looking at this domain and say, okay, it's rsgsv.net. Let's look up that domain and see what the SPF is settings for that. So when it looks up the SPF setting, it says, well, this is the IP address. Is it on the list for rsgsv.net? It is. Okay, let it go. So it's passing at that point. Okay. So for SPF alignment, it's the from header must match the domain use authenticate SPF. So the mail from a return path domain. Those are the two things that are being compared. DKIM. Remember, DKIM is using PKI. It has private key and public key, right? So whatever mechanism you're using, just make sure that private key is safe and secure. So if a third party is using it, hopefully they're keeping it safe and secure for you. But if you're generating it on your own, store it somewhere where it's secure. But remember, it's got to be on the mail server or whatever is being used to sign the DKIM, sign all the messages with DKIM. So it has to be on that. And usually when you do that, they do put it in a secure location and restrict access to that system or to that folder with the private key. What you have to publish in DNS is the public key, right? So that's the string that will have a long string that with the P tag in it. You can have more than one DKIM record. You're not restricted to just one, right? Because each third-party vendor you use most likely will have their own record. Or their own DKIM record. It can either be a CNAME or a text record, so depending on which vendor or whom you're using, but you definitely want to use this if you're using a cloud service provider sending email. If they have DKIM capability, turn it on, right? Because remember, for SPF, if you put in protection.outlook.com or spf.google.com, you're saying any Google servers or any Outlook servers are allowed to send mail on my behalf, but other organizations are using the same exact thing, so they can technically spoof your email ad, your domain, and send out as you. DKIM just adds that additional layer as needed. And then you also do have to worry about alignment and verification for DKIM as well. Because remember, those just like SPF, these are two different things. So when you're doing SPF verification, what it's doing is taking the domain name and the signature and looking that up for the DKIM public key. Right? For alignment, it's taking the domain in the message, in the DKIM message header, in the signature, and comparing that to your from address. So those are the things that have to match. So for alignment, so again, it's just giving you an example. Here's everything is aligned because the DKIM domain is globalcyberalliance.org. I should have put the from, but the from is also is set to globalcyberalliance.org. But here's something that's a mismatch because mixsignup.com obviously is not part of globalcyberalliance.org. So it fell unaligned, right? Because there's two completely separate domains and individual domains. So that's where alignment issues come into place. So those are things you have to look for in terms of, so remember, DKIM verification and DKIM alignment are two different things. Same with SPF. SPF verification and SPF alignment are two separate things, but you need to make sure that they both are aligned and passing in order for this to completely work. Now, things to take into account when DNS implementation. Remember, again, you can only have one record per domain for DMARC, right? I mean, each subdomain can have their own policy as well if you choose to create those, but it's one record per domain because that's what you're protecting. SPF is also one record per domain. And remember, when you're putting the SPF record in place, you don't need to provide a host name for SPF. So they may say you have to put the @ symbol in there, but it'll let you know if you have to put something in there or if you can just leave it blank or no. For DKIM, you can have multiple records, but remember, it must start with a selector. So selector dot and the dot underscore domain key also needs to be there as well, right? But it starts as a selector and then goes to dot underscore domain key for it to be valid. Whether it's a CNAME or whether it be a text record, doesn't matter. It's going to always follow this mechanism. Now, if you're using bind or Linux, remember, in the bind zone file, there could be a line that says $origin and then your domain. Anything after that line automatically appends the domain name, so you don't have to add and type out the domain. Anything before that, you have to type in the domain. So realize and watch where you actually are putting and creating your DNS records, right? Because if it's before the $origin, you actually have to put in the fully qualified domain name. If it's after the origin, you do not have to add the fully qualified domain name. And in bind, it requires the quotation marks, right? Because in DMARC and DKIM policies, when you create those, it puts a semicolon. And in bind, the semicolon, anything after the semicolon is considered a comment. So that's why you need the quotation marks. So it basically says whatever's in quotation, that's exactly how the value is supposed to be seen. So the semicolon is not considered a comment as long as it's between the quotation marks. But to realize though, not all DNS will require you to have a fully qualified domain name or the quotation marks, right? I mean, if you remember, like some cloud service providers, like we did one-on-one, we didn't have to put the quotation marks in because it automatically added it for us. But in Google, when we were creating the text record, it made us put in the quotation marks, right? So it should tell you and it should spit out saying like, no, you need to put this in or you're missing these values. So make sure you have this in place. So that's everything in terms of the DNS and how things are going on in that sense. Now, DMARC reports. Two types of reports. There's the aggregate report, which you're using the RUA tag for, and the forensic or failure reports, which you're using the RUF tags for, right? So what's the difference between the two? So your aggregate reports are the ones that we're saying should be required. You need to put in RUA because that's the one that's going to give you all the information that you're looking for, right? It's going to give you the IP addresses of all the systems that the receiving server is seeing using your domain name. So all the messages that receiving side gets, whether it be a legitimate, fraudulent, spam IP, it's going to include that in that report, but as long as it sees it. But along with the IP address, the information that will be in there is going to say, okay, this is how we're handling the SPF side, and this is how we're handling DKIM. So SPF is going to tell you what the domain is. It's going to tell you if it's passing or failing verification, and it's going to tell you if it's passing or fail on aligning in terms of for DMARC. So it'll tell you about the SPF alignment. Same thing with DKIM. It'll give you your domain that's being used in the DKIM signature. It'll tell you whether DKIM verification is passing or failing, and it'll tell you about alignment as well. So there's a lot of information in there, and it's useful to you. It's not only at level none, but it can also be useful to you at level reject, right? Because in reject, you can find out, is there any spam going on? Is your domain being used for spam? Because then you can take that information and put it into blacklist. You can tell your customer service department or your IT department to say, hey, look, we are seeing a huge spam campaign using our domain name. So in case somebody calls, you're better prepared to let them know, like, yes, we know that this is going on, and we're hopefully, doing whatever we can to prevent some of the actual messages to get through, right? And if you think about it, I mean, how does that make you look, right? If a customer or a citizen is calling you and you already have an answer for them saying like, yeah, no, we know about this, and we're handling it, it makes you look good, right? It increases confidence in you saying like, oh, these guys already know about that, they're already on top of it and they're handling it. So it helps with that reputation aspect. That's why I think that when you're at reject that you should still have reporting set up. I mean, you may not look at the reports as often, but at least you have those reports and you can look at it. So now remember, so forensic reports are going to be actual messages. So it's not technically a report, it's the actual message. And that message could be the full message. So it may look as if you were a recipient of that message when you're not actually the recipient. Because you'll see who's sending the message, who the message is intended for. You'll get the message body, you'll get all the message headers. In some cases, you may get an attachment as well. So there's a lot of information that's in there, because the point is for you to look at the email headers and see from the email headers what's causing this particular message to fail. Is it just SPF? Is it just DKIM? What are the different things in the email headers that you can look to try to fix things, right? Because the aggregate report's not going to give you that detail level. So it might be a little bit harder to figure it out, whereas the failure reports can somewhat help you. Now, will you get forensic reports from everyone? It's not guaranteed either. In most cases, the large providers have decided not to send forensic reports because of privacy concerns, right? Because you could have a full-blown message in there, right? You're seeing who it's from and who it's being sent to. So there's a privacy level concern there. And so a lot of the receiving sides, they just don't want to deal with their privacy issues. So they're going to basically say at that point, let's not send it, and we're not going to worry about it. Does the RUF always include the message body, or can the ISP strip the message body but send the rest of the RUF? Yeah, the RUF is not always going to have the message body in it. In most cases, it may just be the message header. So it depends on the receiving side on how they want to send it, or if they want to even send it at all. So they can decide how much of it they want to send. And that's why a lot of the larger ESPs, they're looking back at this and saying, okay, well, you know what, maybe we'll send it, but let's strip out certain things. So they are visiting that and they're taking a look, and that's why you may start revisiting it. But the other problem with RUF is that, remember, these will actually be the messages. So it's not going to be an aggregate. So the other problem that they face is that you may get a ton of these, right? You may get a lot of these RUF reports. So that's also another potential problem, where you could potentially get 1,000 of these if there's 1,000 messages that are failing the DMARC checks. So that's where the other part of it that they're thinking about, like, okay, well, does it make sense to do this? Now, for the aggregate reports are what are sent in an XML format. So they're actually in a zipped file. Inside that zip file is an XML document. And remember, you can send to multiple addresses if you choose to. How many of these reports you're going to get really depends on how many email messages you're sending out, on a daily basis. So if you have your email server set up where you can actually see that, that's great. If you can actually reduce it as far as to say, okay, what domains you're actually sending to rather than the total number of emails, that's even better, because that can give you an idea of how many reports you could potentially get back. But that's more for the aggregate. The forensic reports, the number of emails you send out, there's a chance you can get that same exact number back. I mean, it typically isn't, but it could be close. But remember, with the reports, there's a lot of information in here. So you can use these reports not only to help you with your SPF and DKIM and the alignment settings and whatnot to get you up to quarantine or reject, but you can also use it for IT asset inventory, right? And you could also prevent people from signing up for anything that they want to sign up for and start sending messages, right? Because if you're at reject, they sign up for a marketing tool online to send email, those messages are going to get rejected because they're not part of your SPF and there's no DKIM. So they actually have to now go through the IT department and say, okay, look, we want to sign up for this. Can you help us get this working? And then on top of that, you get all those spammers and phishers, which you can use for other cybersecurity type information. So you can put them in a block list. You can report out that information to like local law enforcement or like Europol, Interpol, FBI, and so on. Now, sample aggregate reports, right? This is what one looks like. I'm not going to show a forensic report because that actually has information in it. At least the ones that I have, copies that I have is actual information, so I can't really share those. But I mean, this is not the way you want to do it, obviously. You can do it this way. You can open them up, take a look at them. I mean, if you're a small organization, maybe getting 5 or 6 reports, yeah, it's not too bad. But the larger you are, the more emails you send, these reports can be relatively large. So you want to have something that could let you see it in a format that you can actually view it. Because again, if you look at this compared to this, right, this is much easier to see. It's much cleaner. It's nice and spread out in columns, and you can actually see what's going on. So just really quickly, some things to look for, and these are things that we faced at Global Cyber Alliance. One, in terms of DKIM issues. So we had problems when we first implemented DKIM. Especially because the fact that we wanted it to be at the 2048 rather than 1024. So we were using a cloud service provider, and I tried putting in the DNS records in multiple fashions, or sorry, the DKIM records in multiple fashions in terms of breaking it, splitting it, and it kept failing, as you can see here. So SPF was working fine, but DKIM was having issues. It saw that there was one, but it kept failing or permanent error because the entire string wasn't there. The string was getting cut off. So what we had to do is actually go out to I had to reach out to the help desk of that service provider and tell them, like, look, this is what I need to get put in. Can you please put it in? And they actually were able to do it for me. Even though, so the front end that they provided wasn't allowing me to do it, but they can do it on their back end and they can implement it for you. So if you want to use 2048 for DKIM, talk to the help desk, because in some cases, they can actually just put it in for you rather than you trying to put it into place. Spoofing. And really where you're going to see a spoofing is if you see in the SPF or a DKIM a domain that you don't know, that's most likely going to be the one that most likely is going to be a spoofed message, or it could be a forwarded message in some cases, depending on the situation. So that's where you're going to see, okay, is this something that we need to use, and this is something that's valid. And then DKIM and SPF issues, right? So here we're seeing that it's the globalcyberalliance.org, but it's using hostedemail.com, and we don't use that. We don't use this as a provider in any way or any format. So this is why the message got quarantined. So, but you see under DKIM, even though DKIM is passing, but the domain is wrong, right? The domain is not Global Cyber Alliance, even though it says Global Cyber Alliance -- so on and so forth. But this failed unaligned because remember, for alignment, the domain must match the from. And this doesn't match in any way. I mean, it says Global Cyber Alliance, but that's not globalcyberalliance.org. This is a completely different domain and server. And then SPF did a soft fail, and DMARC failed, but because the domain is, Global Cyber Alliance, it did a soft fail mainly because this IP address and this domain has nothing to do with Global Cyber Alliance. It's not in our SPF, so it failed. I mean, if this was in our SPF, then this would be aligned pass, but in this case, it completely failed. Even though, and so then most likely this is a forwarded message, but I mean, the tools that you could use are the ones that are actually out there. So somebody is asking, what am I using? What did I take these screenshots from? This is from the free tool that DMARC has available. So they have an XML to human uploader. I just use that to take screenshots from it. So DMARC's tool. So here are the different service providers. So during the past 2 weeks, and you heard from most of these providers, the only ones that we weren't able to fit into the schedule because of conflicts were Proofpoint and Pro DMARC. But those are other 2 good tools that you can use. Just realize that not all of them do just DMARC. So like Agari, 250 OK, Proofpoint, they provide other services other than just the DMARC. So they provide other capabilities and email fraud protection on top of the DMARC protection and DMARC aggregate tools. But these are ones that you can consider using. I mean, these really are partners. I mean, this is not the extensive list. There are other providers out there as well. Like I think there's one group called Easy DMARC. There's another one that's called DMARCify. There's another one whose name escapes me at this point. I think they're like Easy Solutions or something like that you can use as well. But then we understand from the GCA standpoint that, I mean, there's obviously going to be some level of cost associated with using any one of these providers, but there are different free options that are out there. And I put in free in quotes because you may have to actually take additional steps. So the software might be free, but you may have to have some sort of infrastructure in the back end. So like the UK National Cybersecurity Center has a great tool, but you may have to set up some servers in order to allow for the system to work, right? Because you need something to accept messages, something that will pass on the messages to this tool and so on. But we still wanted to provide folks with a list of different tools that you can actually use. So like somebody asked about what I was using. So if you look at the one here, XML to human converters, DMARCian's XML uploader, that's what I was using to take screenshots so I can show you some examples. But this is a manual effort if you use the XML uploader, right? And it's best to use something like this for a small number of reports, because what it's basically doing is allows you to upload, say you have 10 reports, you can upload all 10 reports, but it's not going to give you one view of the report. It'll actually give you 10 reports. So you actually have to you still have to go into 10 individual reports to view those. So it's still, but and it's easier to read now, but it's still 10 separate reports. So if you have 20, you'll still get 20 separate reports and so on and so forth. So those are things you have to take into account when you use some of these tools. So you're gonna have to put in, things in there, and they do have some level of limitations when you use some of these tools. Like the XML uploader, you may have to refresh the page a few times before it actually displays the information. So those are things you have to take a look into, like the Postmark. Postmark actually sends you weekly reports instead of daily reports. MX Toolbox is also great. I myself have not used it, but I've seen quite a large number of people actually starting to use MX Toolbox and really actually recommend those reports using the MX Toolbox as well. So what are your next steps? So if you haven't done P equals none, please go ahead and do that. Implement it, put it into place, get started, don't wait, right? You have all this information we gave to you fresh in your head, so start implementing it. Don't wait too long to do this. And we can actually help you with the process if you need help with it, just to go through it and guide you through the process. But once you have P equals none and you have the RUA and RUF set up, review those reports. Make the changes that you need to make, right? Do you need to add anything to SPF? Do you need to create DKIM records? Are things being aligned or are they not aligning? And look at those kinds of things. And then get up to P equals quarantine or reject, right? But even if you add quarantine or reject, continue to review those reports. I mean, you may not need to look at them on a daily basis, but review them every so often just to make sure things are functioning correctly and things are working correctly. And then make the adjustments. Because remember, once you're at reject or quarantine, anything that's new needs to be added, right? You need to add it to SPF, and if there's a DKIM capability, add it to DKIM. Add the DKIM record for it. Apply. And also, if you have public domains that aren't using for email, start off with a reject. Go protect those right now. There's no reason to wait for those. Do it, implement it, put it into place, put in a policy of reject, create that blank SPF record, right? V equals SPF1-all. Create that. Because at least those are being protected, and those aren't going to be used in any spam or phishing type campaigns. And then consider using additional authentication mechanisms. Don't just stick with DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. I'm going to talk about a few of these on the next few slides. And again, just going back to that domain takedown project that we're working on, if you want to send us aggregate reports, we would like that because it will just help the project and help us determine if this is something that's viable and we can actually do. So in your RUA, make sure you put in, and again, don't put it as your first one, put it as your secondary or tertiary one, mail2:DMARC@gca-emailauth.org. So this is live. You can start sending it to it now if you would like to. So other email authentication. So we talked about SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So there's two other ones that work alongside with DMARC. So Bimmy and ARC are the two that we're going to talk about. And this, just so people know, I have the source in here, this article that was written by Yusuf Khan on medium.com. It's for a great article for CIOs to read about what does email authentication solve for. So, don't try, I'm going to share the slides. I'm going to try my best to get those slides, this slide deck out today, so that way you can go to this source and read this article. It's a really great article, and this is where I got that image from. But let's go into these two. So again, this is just introductory. I'm not going to go into great detail because most of these things can take another 30 minutes to an hour just to go into like a deep dive into it. But ARCs, Authenticated Received Chain. What this is going to do is going to make sure that any authenticated or protected messages that are using SPF, DKIM, and or DMARC are actually going to be able to be passed on. They're going to be able to forward it on without breaking the authentication mechanism. And that's what the idea is, right? So, because that will happen. Like if you're sending a message to a listserv, the listserv then takes that email and passes it on to everybody else on that listserv. So that's why authentication fails and breaks, right? So that's going to be important for those people who use these kinds of things. So mail forwarders and mail list servers or mail intermediaries. Those are the only systems that you're going to implement ARC on. Not all organizations need to do this. So like at Global Cyber Alliance, we don't need to do this because we don't have mail list servers or mail forwarding systems, right? So someone like Google would do this because they have something called like Google Groups. Yahoo would do this because they have Yahoo Groups, right? Because you send the message to it and then the message passes it on. And in fact, Google and Yahoo are actually using this, and that's why, because they find that their groups were breaking because of SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So they had to implement ARC so that way they could preserve this. So those are the levels. So it's not going to be something that every organization needs to do unless you actually have a mail list server implemented in your organization. So maybe like schools, so like universities and colleges, they may do something like ARC, but otherwise, organizations don't need to do this. But if you're interested in it, go to arc-spec.org. There's some information there on how to do it. Points you to a few tools and listservs that actually do use ARC. And there is a tool called OpenARC that you could actually implement and install on a system if you do have a mail list server that doesn't have ARC built into it. But those are things to take into account. But again, you do not need to use ARC unless you're a mail forwarder or a mailing list system, okay? Bimmy is another tool that's out there. And this Bimmy is still a work in progress. So it's not, you can implement and you can go ahead and start it, but it's not completely finalized. So meaning that, so Bimmy is brand indicators for message identification. And what it's basically doing is saying that, hey, we're going to use DMARC at a policy of quarantine or reject, but here's another layer of authentication we're going to add, is which basically is an image. As long as it's this image, that means visually that this actually is coming from our domain and it's actually being used for our domain. So it's a visual aspect for the end user, for the receiving side to see that. But this doesn't work with everybody quite yet. Right now it works with Yahoo, right? But it also works for people who send a large amount of messages, right? So if you don't send too many messages, you're not going to see this quite work for you just yet. It will at some point when it's solidified, but if you send a large number of emails, you're most likely to see Bimmy work for you. Okay, because like GCA does have this implemented, but when I send it to a Yahoo account from our work email, I don't see our image there quite yet. Google is supposedly going to be supporting this at some point next year, and so there's going to be more and more organizations that are going to be supporting this. And then there's also another layer that they're looking at adding, which is another certificate authority, right? Because how do you know where you put that file, that image file on your website, that's actually for your domain? So they want to add another layer, and they're going to do some sort of certificate authority mechanism to add that additional layer of authentication. But if you want to go ahead and do it, you can actually go ahead and start implementing it now. The host name is going to be default._Bimmy, and then the value will be v equals Bimmy1 semicolon L equals, and then the path to where your image file is located. So https:// your domain name / the file name. And the file that you're using, the image file, has to be an SVG file. It's not any other file type. It has to be SVG. Okay. So if you're looking for any additional information, there's two references right there, bimmygroup.org and bimmy.agari.com. Both of them, you can actually go to bimmy.agari.com, pop in your domain name, and it'll tell you what the record you need to create. So it has a lot of good information in there. So you can do this, but don't expect it to be fully functional at this point. And that's a great question. Somebody, what would prevent a spammer from linking to your SVG file? And that's where that additional certificate authority, that's where that is supposed to come into play to help protect against things like that. So that's why it's still a work in progress. There's some things that they still need to fix and need to make adjustments to in order to make it so that spammers can't just link to your SVG files. But so great question there. Now there are some other email authentication mechanisms. So this is outside of DMARC, okay? So the three that I have listed here have nothing to do with DMARC. It's not requiring that DMARC has to be in place. It's not going to conflict with DMARC in any way, or SPF or DKIM, Bimmy or ARC. None of that's going to impact. What these do are it's going to allow for secure communication between two email servers. That's what these email authentication. So whereas DMARC was doing the identity check and checking the messages, this is saying, okay, before we communicate, let's make sure that we set up a secure connection between the two of us, to making sure that you're actually using TLS and actually doing the implementation of it. So one is DANE, which is DNS-based authentication of named entities. Now the thing is with DANE, it does require DNSSEC in order for it to work. And that's where it becomes a little bit of a problem of actually doing the implementation, because not all registrars and all email hosting providers support DNSSEC. Right, so you have to take that into account. So you have to look for your registrar to see, hey, will you provide this type of record? This is a specific type of record you have to create called a DS record. You have to see if they can supply you with the information that you need to create the DS record, so that way you can put it into your DNS or provide it to your hosting provider and say, look, I need this DS record created. Here's all the information. Can you please create it for me and implement for me? So it's not fully supported in terms of the DNS side, and the DNS side is required in order for this to work. It is something that is being used. So obviously, because there's an RFC that's available there, it is used, I know, quite widely especially in the Netherlands, and it's starting to gain traction in the EU. So this is why we're putting it out here so people can look into it and see it. It is a bit complex in terms of doing it and going through the process, but a lot of it really requires, like, if you use a cloud service provider, they're the ones who actually have to do the DNS aspect for you. It's not something that you would do at your organization, except for the DNSSEC part, right? So like at Global Cyber Alliance, we were looking to do it. We have DNSSEC on our domain, but for DANE setup, we have to have our Google email servers actually support DANE. They have to do it on the Google server side. That's not something that we would be setting up and configuring. Then there's MTA-STS. This is just like DANE, except the difference being it doesn't need DNSSEC. It actually requires you to have a valid website that has a valid SSL cert. So it's not I don't think it allows self-signed. It has to be a third-party valid SSL certificate that you're using. And it's really just you bring your policy, you're putting up a text record that has your policy in it, defining that, look, we support TLS, we're using TLS, and we want to establish a secure connection between our servers and your servers. And MTA-STS works alongside with TLS reporting, because that's the TLS reporting, so that's TLS RPT. The reporting is what actually is going to give you back the information and just let you know if things are set up correctly or if messages are failing. So that way you can know, because MTA-STS actually has a test mode and an enforcement mode, right? So the TLS reporting is what's going to tell you, like, look, these messages are failing, and if they're failing, then you want to, you don't want to have MTA-STS at a enforce mode, because you want messages to actually keep going through, because if they fail, that means the secure connection wasn't established. If the secure connection is not established, then messages aren't going to get through. So those are some other ones to look at too. MTA STS is something that is now being supported by Google, and they announced it this year. So that's why we went ahead and implemented it, because we wanted to learn more about it, and we're still in that learning stages. So that's everything that we talked about in about, what, 58 minutes of everything that was covered in the 6 weeks, except, obviously some new things as well. So just some final things to just mention. Next week at some point, we'll be sending out a survey about the bootcamp. Please respond back to the survey, because we're looking for feedback for this bootcamp. We want to make sure, obviously people are happy with this, people that we're doing the right things, or what changes we need to make in order to make improvements on this, because we are planning to do this bootcamp again next year. We'll probably do it twice, once in the first half and once in the latter half of the year. But that survey is going to help us make the changes we need to make the improvements that we make. So please do respond back to that once you get it. And again, we'll be handing out the certificate of completion over the next few weeks. So again, that's as long as you attended 6 sessions, or 6 sessions, an hour long, the full hour. So it's not just attending the 6 sessions and spending like 20, 30 minutes in the session. We're expecting 45 minutes to an hour in each session in order to get these certificate of completion. So you have some other resources here. So DMARC.org is a great one, because they're the ones who actually created it and developed DMARC. But then we have our own GCA information here as well. So for the bootcamp, the resource page here is where you're going to get all the webinars and the resources and whatnot and stuff there. So as long as you have the link, it's there. We are going to be linking to it on our website as well. So dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org. It'll be in the resource drop-down list once we do link it. So I expect the link to probably go live sometime next week. Also, please sign up for the community forum, because that's a great place to ask questions. And I'm not the only one on there. There are other people, other subject matter experts that are on there as well. So please register for that, so you can ask any questions that you have. But you are welcome to email me directly. We're here to help. Just because the bootcamp ends tomorrow doesn't mean that we're going to stop helping you. Right? It's not like it's not going to be you send me an email, I'm going to say, oh, nope, sorry, the boot camp's done, I can't help. No, we here at GCA are here to help you from here on out in any way that we can. Okay, so please continue to reach out to ask for any guidance, any help that you need. Go to the community forum, post there if you choose to, however you want to do it. We are here to help you get to reject as best as we can. If we can't get you to reject, we'll point you to the right direction and people who can help you get to reject. Okay, so please don't stop after the bootcamp. Keep moving along, keep getting. If you're not at none, get to none. If you're at none, get to reject. Okay. So we do have other 2 projects. So I know we're a minute over. I'm going to stay on longer for Q&A, because there's a lot of people on, and there's some questions here that I do want to answer. But quickly, so we do have other GCA projects. We have a cybersecurity toolkit, which we were looking at a lot of feedback for that as well, for small businesses and elections. We're planning on expanding on that. So if you're interested, take a look, and you can email us any questions, and I can pass you on to the right people for that. And same with the AID project, which happens to do with IoT. So we're doing some IoT research where we have honey nets and we have clusters set up where we're collecting a lot of data and a lot of information. So if anyone's interested in research or contributing to this AID platform, contact us, and we can work. I can point you to the right person to get to talk about the AID project. So I know people are dropping off, so I'm just putting this here so for email contact information. But what I want to do is go through some of these questions and make sure that I answer these questions. So one question is, do you want domain reports while we're still adjusting our SPF and DKIM? Yes, please, because we're pilot. This is a pilot. We want to see how much we can consume if we're at the right settings in terms of the amount of space and the amount of processing power, or if we need to increase it. So yes, if you can still do that while you're working on it, that's perfectly fine. Will the partner sessions be available online? Yes, they will be online. We're working on it today to get those up. We were just waiting for all the vendor or the partner sessions where we're waiting for them to review and tell us which session was the one they wanted us to post. So hopefully they should be going up somewhat today, but look for them tomorrow. How long will these resources be maintained? Indefinitely. So as long as GCA exists, these resources will be available to you. So that includes all the sessions, that will include all the resources that we're linking to. I missed 2 classes. Can I watch the recorded sessions and still get the certificate? No, sorry, because we have no way of tracking whether you watch the recorded sessions or not, and we're concerned about auditing. We don't want people who could potentially get audited when you submit this for CPE credits with whatever you're using. You're submitting for CPE because you can get audited, and when you get audited, they're going to ask for proof. And we don't. If you come to us and say, "Hey, can you tell them that I watched these sessions?" We have no proof, because especially if they come back to ask for us. Whereas the webinars, the live sessions, we have proof. We can actually say like, "Yep, they were here, and this is how long they were on for." So yeah, sorry, we can't do that for recorded sessions. So there's a question here. I've created an _DMARC record just like that using our on mail 2 I provided to our DNS provider, but I never started receiving reports. So if you can just email me directly, so that way I know which domain it is, and we can take a look at your record just to make sure there's nothing wrong with the record. It could also be potentially that you're just, the people you're sending to are just not sending reports. So that's, that's what could potentially happen. So, but email me directly so that way we can focus on that and take a look at what's going on. So when I say 6 sessions, do you mean any of them or just weeks 5 and 6? Any 6 sessions. So if over the 6 weeks you attended 6 or more sessions, those will count, including the partner ones. So which companies present on the 8th, 11th, and 15th? Great question. So on the 8th, I believe it was 250 OK. The 11th, sorry, I just have to look at my calendar. The 11th was Redshift, and the 15th was DMARC 360. So it's great. So I believe I got all the questions that are there. So we are 5 minutes over. I'm willing to stay on in case there are any other questions, because I know a lot of people are still dropping off. But I'll wait another minute just to see if there's any questions. If not, thank you everyone for joining this. Thank you for taking the information, and please, we're asking people to go ahead and please implement DMARC and take that into account, and keep coming back to us if you want, or to whomever you feel comfortable going to help you with the process. We're here to help as much as we can, and we want to make sure people can get to where they need to get to and actually implement it. All right, so I don't see any more questions at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the session. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and I hope that you got a lot out of our boot camp.